Howdy everyone, and today I have something very interesting to show you, a little lens known as the Kamlan 50mm f1.1, which is marketed by a company called Sainsonic. It's for mirrorless cameras with an APS-C sized sensor, and it's currently available for Sony E-mount and Canon EOS M mount cameras. It's also going to be available for Fuji X and Micro Four Thirds system cameras soon. Most popular mirrorless cameras, basically. I'd like to thank Sainsonic for sending me a copy of this lens for testing, although as always this is an independent review and not sponsored by them in any way. Kamlan are a Chinese manufacturer, and it's a manual focus lens which can be found for only about £130 or $150 US. You heard me right, a 50mm f1.1 lens for only $150 over on Amazon, brand new. That is an incredibly small amount of money for such a wide aperture lens. A lot of people might be interested in buying this lens simply for its amazing value proposition, because whether or not a lens is sharp at f1.1, you can still get stunning pictures and nice portrait shots. On my Sony APS-C camera, the focal length of 50mm is the full frame equivalent of 75mm, meaning this lens gives you a bit of reach for shallow depth of field and subject photography. And that maximum aperture of f1.1 is extremely wide, around 66% brighter than f1.4. For anyone wondering about the ratios, f1.2 is a third of a stop brighter than f1.4, f1.1 is 2/3 brighter, and f1.0 is a whole stop brighter. But let's see how that translates into real life. Here are two pictures taken from the same position. The one on the left is taken by the Kamlan lens at f1.1, and the one on the right is an adapted 50mm Canon lens at f1.4. You'll notice two things. Firstly, the background with the Kamlan lens looks considerably more out of focus. You can especially see that in the size of the bokeh balls there. And secondly, the Kamlan lens enabled a 30% faster shutter speed than the Canon. Wait a minute, 30%? It's meant to be f1.1, which should be 60% faster, right? Well, actually, because of the way digital camera sensors are made, they can only physically accept so much light. No matter what lens you put on them, you won't really get a faster shutter speed than that offered by an f1.2 aperture or so. So I'm not surprised to see the Kamlan lens enabling a 30% faster shutter speed than the Canon. But to my eyes, the depth of field looks about maybe 50% narrower, the backgrounds look considerably more blurry, so I'm satisfied that this is truly an f1.1 lens, or at least close enough. Let's look at the lens itself. It's an amazingly small piece of kit with a very solid metal body which feels nicely engineered. It's weighty for its size, coming in at just under 300 grams, but that's understandable as it's jam-packed with glass, and that front glass element does look lovely. As I mentioned, it's a fully manual lens, manual focus, manual aperture. The focus ring works very smoothly, being nicely damped, and it runs about 180 degrees. That's just about precise enough for manual focusing, although a bit more precision would definitely have been nice. The aperture ring works smoothly, without any clicks. Most photographers prefer to have an aperture ring with clicks at each f-stop, but the smooth aperture mechanism could at least be useful for video makers. The calibration of the aperture ring didn't seem quite right to me. Judging by the shutter speeds in my tests, it didn't seem to actually stop anything down until you reached the marking for f2. But anyway, the ring does at least turn very smoothly too, and the iris mechanism has 12 blades for smoother bokeh when it's stopped down. The front of the lens has a metallic 52mm filter thread. It comes with the usual front and rear lens caps, a cleaning cloth, and a small plastic hood. Overall, considering the price you're paying, the build quality is great, and I really like its small size. Now on to image quality. The lens is only made up of 5 glass elements, so it's a pretty basic optical design here. I'll be testing it on a Sony a6300 with its 24 megapixel APS-C sensor. At f1.1, the good news is that in the middle of the image we see a sweet spot of high sharpness, making the lens usable for portrait photography. However, at f1.1, contrast is a bit low and we see quite some purple fringing. When you're shooting a less high contrast subject, that will be less noticeable. Let's look in the corners. They are extremely soft. There's no image quality here to speak of. We begin to see an improvement at f2. Well, the corners are about the same, but the middle of the image sees a lot more contrast and the purple fringing is almost gone. At f2.8, the image in the middle is fantastic and the corners are, well, beginning to improve. At f4 though, there's a noticeable improvement. There's a lot more sharpness, but the very edges of the image are looking quite smeared. The best image quality comes at f11, where there's great sharpness and contrast across the image frame. Again though, the very edges are smeared, and some pink and green chromatic aberration is also visible. So, well, technically, it's hard to assess the little Kamlan lens very positively. It definitely needs quite some stopping down to become fully useful. But even at f1.1, there is at least good center sharpness, so it is quite possible to use this lens effectively for portrait or subject photography. Okay, let's see about distortion and vignetting. It's quite good news here. The lens projects just a touch of barrel distortion, which is barely noticeable. At f1.1 there is some vignetting, but it's not strong and it falls quite gently, so you don't tend to notice that either, oddly enough. Stop down to f2 or f2.8 and it's gone. Let's see about close-up image quality. The lens can focus as closely as about 50 centimeters. At f1.1, even in the middle the image quality is fairly soft close-up. At f2 there's an improvement, and also at f2.8, and finally at f4 the image quality is sharp. So stopping down will greatly benefit your close-up pictures. How well does this lens work against bright light? Definitely not very well. We see a lot of flaring and some very colourful patterns emerging. It looks pretty beautiful though, but technically it is a problem. Use the lens hood as much as possible. So the last thing we look at is bokeh. This lens can give you some seriously out of focus backgrounds at f1.1, but how do they look? Generally, those out of focus backgrounds look a little busy, but not in a terribly bad way. When they're deeply out of focus, they look fine and smooth. So, overall, the Kamlan lens is nicely built and very small, and if you're prepared to add some contrast and sharpness to your images, it's usable at f1.1. Technically, its image quality is not impressive. Its corners are really very soft, and other manufacturers offer lenses with far more resolution and contrast, but no one can argue with this Kamlan lens's amazingly low price. $150 for an APS-C f1.1 lens is astonishing. For anyone who's just bought a mirrorless camera and who's on a low budget, this lens could get you some really nice images if you don't mind a bit of manual focusing. If this is what's in your price range and you're ready for a little experimenting, then I would say it's worth a punt.